Hi, welcome everyone. I'll be giving a workshop on how to debate social movements and what are some of the key things you would like to keep in mind when you are discussing social movements. Since this is a relatively short workshop, I will just go over some of the very basic things to keep in mind, not discussing specific motions too much, and just as general ideas that should be applicable to almost any social movements debate. So first of all, we'll go through some types of motions that are very common, look at common clash points, and then go through them in depth for effectiveness, new members, and existing members, and then conclude by comparing these clash points and how you can win with any of them and what type of weighing you would have to do for that to work. So starting with types of motions, I'm sure there are other ways to categorize this, but to me it seems that most broadly, these are the three most common types of motions that you are going to encounter. I would say the first one is by far the most common. So that is talking about a specific policy or action that a social movement should take in order to forward its goals. So this can look like more general things such as, should social movements use political violence, or should they use should social movements use shaming as a tactic for social change? But it can also be very specific. For example, the motion that I've put here is this House believes that the feminist movement should support instances of commercialization of stereotypically female interests. So it can range from relatively broad to relatively specific in terms of what the emotion is, but essentially the question is, should we do this X thing as the social movement, or is it beneficial if the social movement does it? The second type of motion that you might see is, how should movements look like? So most often it can be things such as, this house prefers leaderless social movements over movements with leaders, but it can also be things such as comparing global versus local movements. Very common, I would say, in environmental debates, whether the focus should be on local or a global agenda. And then the third group I named as general social movements theory. So this is often when it's not specified to a specific social movement, but rather how social movements should look like in general. So an example of this is that this house believes that contemporary social movements should focus on class differences rather than identity-based differences. So it's going to obviously incorporate how specific policy looks like or how the movement looks like, but it is a lot more generalized to what social movement theory tells us about this. These are more niche topics and possibly require a bit more critical analysis of social movement theory. But I think these are the most common things. Why this is important is because knowing the motion type can help you prioritize which clashes you are going to focus on. The clashes I will talk about on the next slide, but essentially, probably when you're talking about a specific policy or action, it is most useful to think about effectiveness, how movements should look like, talks both about attracting new members as well as existing members. And then general social movements theory, I think, has a lot of focus on membership, gaining people to join. I think that is a very core aspect of it. So you will obviously be able to make arguments on all range of issues in all of them, but just knowing the motion type or kind of thinking like, oh, what is this motion mostly about, might help you narrow down what you might want to focus on specifically in your case. So what are the most common clash points? So I have identified three that I would say that you're able to make arguments on in almost all social movements debates. So this means if you get a social movements motion in a competition and you're like struggling to come up with arguments, try to think through all of these three things and how you can make an argument on your side based on these issues. So the first one is, how effective is the movement in achieving its goal? Again, this is very obvious when you're talking about a specific policy, but it is actually also true for example, the leaderless versus leadered movements. There, you will inevitably have to talk about how effective the movement is in trying to do what it wants to do. The second thing is getting more people to join, supporting the movement. How can we have a very broad base of support? And then the third one is talking about supporting existing members of these movements. I will now go through in depth of all of these clashes, but I just want you to remember that you can, in almost any social movements debate, make arguments based on this. So starting with effective movements, where essentially the question we're answering is, how can a social movement be as effective as possible in achieving its goal when it is a specific policy, like using political violence, or the feminist example that I gave could be like, should social movements support affirmative action? That it is about the specific policy and how effective that is in achieving its aim. I would say that the best way to win the effectiveness clash is, first of all, by giving a detailed description of change, and then secondly, having strong characterization. I will go through the characterization because I think this is really, really key in these effectiveness clashes. But first, just a note on the detailed description of change. I think this is more obvious when you get a motion like, how does affirmative action help individuals? Then you should talk through the detailed arguments in terms of like, oh, it's going to offer opportunities that people otherwise wouldn't have. You have role models, and you give good arguments with structure, with mechanisms, and with examples, ideally, to actually detail the change. Because if you say, oh, of course, affirmative action is going to, help people get into university, and then this means that everyone is going to be better off, that's not detailed enough. You don't have robust analysis there. So that is definitely a key thing to do. However, it is kind of hard to generalize this further than this, because the specific mechanisms of change are really independent, depending on the specific motion that you will have. However, I feel like characterization, there are two key things that you usually have to do, either both or either or, in a specific debate that relate to effectiveness. So the first one is characterization of the society that we are living in, characterization of the environment in which the social movement operates. So what this means is essentially you want to have a strong characterization as to why it is likely that your policy is going to work, or if you're in opposition, why it is likely that the policy is not going to work in your favor. Because realistically, when you think of social movements, their effectiveness is dependent on whether people are receptive to the movement, whether people are receptive to the goals of the movement, to what they're trying to achieve, to the methods that they are choosing. So this general receptiveness, this works both in politics, but also in changing the hearts and minds of people on the ground. It is important to characterize this. So the clash there, usually in terms of the characterization, is whether the movement in question has broad societal support or does it have limited support. And if you don't have a specific motion, for example, when your motion is, this house supports the use of shaming to achieve social change, there you don't have a specific motion to a specific movement to talk about, then it is up to you to choose which movements are better for your side of the house in terms of which characterization it works with. And I really am convinced that you can do this characterization in any debate from both sides. You just have to be nuanced enough within your characterization. So one example that we can have is in terms of what type of policy plan or strategy should the social movement have? Should we use courts? A very common motion is this house prefers social movements using courts over legislation to garner social change. So essentially the clash there is, should we have specific cases and go to courts to achieve groundbreaking judgments? I think a famous one obviously is the Roe versus Wade judgment in the US relating to abortion laws. Also gay marriage in America was achieved through a Supreme Court decision. Or should we go through the alternative route and have legislation, a government and a parliament legislating to, for example, make marriage equality into law? So that is the clash that we're talking about. Why is this important in terms of the characterization of the society? Oftentimes, when you talk about the need for courts, you want to characterize that the society isn't very receptive to the social movement itself. For example, when you don't have broad-based societal support to actually go through the voter route and have people vote for or politicians campaign for marriage equality, then it might be significantly easier for you to go through courts, bring specific cases, and then hope that the Supreme Court justices are much more likely to be receptive to this type of thing, find some kind of issue with the Constitution. Obviously, there are other arguments to make in terms of how likely courts are going to be progressive, but this is a separate thing. But in terms of characterizing the society, that is a clash. However, when you're supporting the legislative side, you probably want to characterize the society as someone that is actually receptive. So when you think of the Supreme Court judgment in the US for gay marriage, I want to say this was maybe 2015, if I'm not mistaken, or around that area, it would be possible to characterize that already by that time. We have seen a lot of publicly gay figures. There is already acceptance for this. Actually, it's not so bad. We don't have to go down the courts route, and rather we can campaign during elections for people to actually vote for it. The other example for this is the use of shaming as a tactic for social change. For example, calling someone out as a racist, canceling people on Twitter, all of that. Here, an example of characterization of the society of how it works is if you're in support of shaming, you probably want to characterize social movements as something that are really accepted. And on the other side, you want to characterize it's not accepted. Why? Because for shaming to be effective tactic of social change, you want people to fear being called out. You want people to fear being called a racist, for example. And if you take the example of the United States, I really believe it's possible to characterize it both ways. You can say, oh, we've come already quite far enough. You see people are losing their jobs in the US when people find their racist tweets. Therefore, being called a racist is something that is really bad. People don't want to be associated with it. Therefore, if we shame people, it's likely going to be effective. On the other hand, you can characterize the United States as something that there is so much institutionalized racism. The Republican Party openly forwards many things that are relatively racist. It is still very acceptable to make microaggressions. Black Lives Matter didn't have a lot of broad-based support in the US. And then you can characterize that actually getting called a racist is not very helpful. And if you're an antagonistic social movement, then you're just going to alienate more people. So this is a way in terms of showing when we choose a strategy, is it going to be effective depending on the way you characterize the society. Best way to do it is like look at some videos, workshops on how to do characterization well, but essentially just choosing which type of choosing what kind of society you need for your movement to be effective is really crucial. The other thing is characterizing the specific problem that you're trying to solve. And this is especially the case when you're comparing like alternative strategies. So the question is, which policy will be most helpful for the people that we're actually trying to help, the minorities, the group we're protecting, whoever it might be in the debate. So for example, the individualization of the environmental policy. So that means like debates where like, oh, should environmental movements focus on changing individual behavior versus, I don't know, going through legislation, trying to change corporations, all of that. If you're able to characterize the problem that it is up to the people, they're really not caring about the environment, and they have a really big part to play in terms of like consumption, demand is what creates supply. All of that, you want to characterize the problem is individual action, people not caring about the environment, personally, they buy too many plastic bags, all of that. If you characterize the problem like that, then it is a lot easier for you to say that, oh, we get individual action, we need individual approaches, versus if you characterize the problem as individual people have very limited things that they can actually do in their lives to improve the environment. The fact that I stopped eating meat is not going to be very helpful. And the thing that is really important is that oil corporations stop taking oil out of the ground. Then in that case, it is a lot easier for you to forward legislative change. And obviously there's middle grounds all over there. But essentially, that's kind of the difference. Or again, courts versus legislation. Probably the trade-off there is that courts might be a quicker way to achieve change, get some legislative change out of that, versus legislation requires changing hearts and minds, getting people to actually believe in the social movement. And there, it might be in your interest to characterize, if you're supporting courts, is that legal discrimination is the most important thing that you have. That is the thing that is actually stopping people from enjoying their lives, getting access to housing, getting access to employment, all of that. This is a very tangible harm that you can only achieve if you have a change in law. Versus if you're on the legislation side and you rely on people changing their minds, you might be like, the legal, I don't know, gay marriage isn't as important as actually not being attacked on the street by people who are homophobic or not getting microaggressions, whatever, because that affects you so much more in your daily life. So how you characterize the problem in terms of what we actually need as a solution is a good way of trying to characterize why your policy will be the best in solving the specific problem. So as a conclusion, make sure you have good characterization, but also have a detailed description of how the change is going to work. The next clash point that I identified is getting new members to join or getting people to support your movement as a whole. So the question we ask here is, what is the thing that mobilizes people to join or support a movement, or what are obstacles to actually joining a movement? First idea here is people join when they really understand the gravity of the problem. I think this is a good strategy or a good argument to make when you are defending some radical movements. So things like Just Stop Oil, things such as Extinction Rebellion that use relatively radical means to show the problem is really, really bad. We have to fix the environment or otherwise we're all going to die. If through those tactics you make people understand how bad it is, then they might actually join. On the other hand, something that is probably more useful for like I don't want to say centrist, but maybe not as radical movements, is showing how people can empathize with the victims that you're trying to protect in that certain situation. This is good if movements use more like individualized approaches, where you show people like what is the individual harm, or when you're talking about who should the leaders or spokespeople of the movements be, then you're using relatable spokespersons. Usually this means people that are like the majority, whether it can be, I don't know, when you're talking about a Black Lives Matters movement, someone who is very white-like or has been very whitewashed, one could argue, because that is the most palatable for white people who want to join the movement. Or alternatively, it can be men in feminism. For examples of marriage equality, you can describe the problem as something that like everyone wants love, you know how love feels like, just kind of describing on a very relatable level. So this is a good approach for those very like making movements very palatable for the general majority. And third thing, perception of the movement. I think this is key in deterring people from joining. So if you show a movement as very, very radical, this might deter people from wanting to join the movement because they don't want to be seen associated with something as radical. For example, Just Stop Oil is getting quite a lot of hate for the way or the tactics that they are using in the UK. Maybe you don't want to be associated with that, therefore you just don't join any environmental movement whatsoever because you think that all environmental movements are so radical. And I feel like this might be a bit more outdated within feminism, but I've still heard these arguments floated around the past couple of years as well. People are like, yeah, of course I support women's rights. I think they should have equal rights. However, I'm not a feminist because I don't want to be associated with those radical feminazis. If you create a perception of the movement as very radical, it might actually deter people from joining your movement because they don't want to be associated with something like that. So I would say that all of these approaches obviously have trade-offs. There's also more reasons why people mobilize, but I think these are some of the key ones. For example, using men in feminism can be a good tactic for getting other men to join. At the same time, you're taking away positions where to speak of your own experiences from women who are actually the marginalized group that you're trying to protect. So all of these things obviously have trade-offs. These are just some ideas to think about when trying to win clashes on why we're going to get more members to join. And then last clash point, I think existing members. I want to say this one is quite overlooked quite often, but I feel like it can be argued or made very important. I think the two cases where it's most useful to talk about existing members of a group is when you want to focus on safe spaces, individualized harm, all of that, or secondly, when you talk about a need for strong action. I will talk about these on the next slide a bit more as well. So existing members, the arguments that you would probably make when you want to talk about existing members is a need for safe spaces. So this is a clash point when you're comparing a close-knit versus a broad movement. So essentially, like, should the feminist movement celebrate political icons across across the entirety of the political spectrum? Or how, for example, how wide should the queer movement be? I feel like there are sometimes discourse and debates within the movement of who should be included. The reason why this is important, or like the reason or the arguments you can make there, is if you have a very close-knit community of very similar people, much more likely that you're going to find safe space within there because these are people who share very, very similar experiences with you. You can make opposite arguments for broad movements where you have a very large base of allies. It is probably a lot easier within your own local environment to then find people who are allies who are part of the movement. Then you get safe space through that. And you can contrast, like, are these things important in the first place? But this is something to consider when you're arguing for safe spaces. The second thing is representation within movements. I think this is very very important or very relevant in debates when you have leaders, when you have spokespeople. Um, so there it can become a problem of representation. So, for example, when I would say the issue of Emma Watson as a feminist, I think she was championed as that for a very long time, and she championed herself as a feminist. And as kind of, she was seen as one of the strong voices of the feminist movement, but received a lot of criticism because she's a very rich, white, privileged, beautiful white woman who enjoys all of the privileges in her life. Why is she speaking for the experiences of women who absolutely do not share a single circumstance with her? And then when you have these types of leaders, then it's very likely that the individual members are going to feel represented within the movement, want to be a part of that movement when they really don't see any kind of representation of themselves. I would also say this might happen when you have strict rules and hierarchies within your organization that you necessarily have to follow, or at least you have the perception that you have to follow this when you join that movement or when you want to be a part of that movement. That might alienate existing members when they feel like they are not fulfilling all of those criteria, let's say. So, for example, I would say the vegan community is a good example of this, because I've heard a lot of people say, I have possibly said this myself, is that people who might go on a vegan vegetarian diet and they say, but I don't want to be affiliated with the vegan community because they seem so militant and they have so many strict rules, and if I eat honey once, then I'm not a proper vegan and everyone's going to attack me. So you don't want to associate yourselves with that, so you don't actually advance the cause. And I feel like there are also like very strict rules in terms of like, oh, you have to be vegan for the animals. If you have any other reason for it, and you're not forwarding the welfare of animals, then you're not a proper vegan. So I feel like it has very strict rules. This might not be the case, but this is a perception that I'm talking about here. Then people might not, who are actually like members of the community who follow the same diet, might not actually want to be a part of it, and the movement loses out on some poor people. Or I would say also this can be a problem for environmental movements when it is made to seem like you can only support an environmental movement if you do all of these things to make the most sustainable choices within your life. I feel like oftentimes this might also discourage or alienate members who are from more disadvantaged backgrounds, who don't have the privilege of choosing the more sustainable options, or for whatever reason cannot afford to do so, or they have other things that might be more important within their lives. It might alienate you on those grounds, and I think this is something that is really important to keep in mind for those social movements as well, in terms of how strong they should be advocating within their organization. Now, importantly, those three things, the effectiveness, the new members, and then existing members, I believe that you can win a debate by doing really well on any one of those three, and in very limited manners engaging with the other clashes. Might not always be the case, but I think this is a good way, especially, for example, in closing, to win a debate. And that is if you're able to show why that is the most important thing that we need to care about, either if it's from the perspective of the movement, why that is the most important goal for that movement, or from a general societal perspective. I think you can do that. So here are some ways I feel like in which you can weigh one of these clashes against the other clashes. So starting with effectiveness, I think this is possibly the most intuitive one again. But here you probably want to focus on tangible benefits, legal discrimination, practical problems, and why these are the biggest obstacles. You can say like, okay, safe spaces are all fun and games, but if as a woman I'm still getting paid less than my male colleague, then this is a more active harm to my everyday life and my everyday enjoyment of my life, and actually getting to an equal footing within the society, than the fact that we have a huge feminist movement and everyone supports feminism. I don't really care about that if I'm still getting paid less, and if I'm still getting turned down from positions just because of the perception that I am a woman, or whatever kind of legal discrimination that you can put in there, even if you have a very big movement. So you kind of want to focus on the effectiveness of, we actually just need those tangible things, because just having a large movement is not going to be enough, or a safe space is really not going to be enough. Second, for the new members clash, I think here you want to focus on why it is so necessary to get people to join and support your movement. And it kind of draws down to the effectiveness clash, but essentially, I would say the 2 points under there is that, first of all, if you have a very large supporter base, it actually makes doing effective policy possible, because you have a voter base who can vote on these issues, who can come out to march, who can be the ones who support the tangible change that you need. So even if you have a great policy that you want to forward, but you don't have a large supporter base, then that's really unimportant, because you need someone to vote on it. Or secondly, the changing hearts and minds kind of argument, that the wider a voter base you have is not voter base, supporter base that you have, is these people will probably see a lot more of, I don't know, feminist discourse or anti-racist discourse. And then these are people who are less likely to engage in microaggressions. And there you can do the characterization as to why, even if these are like fringe members who aren't that committed to the actual cause, then the fact that on the street every day we have so many people who are, or so many less people who are going to act in aggressive ways towards you, is already a benefit, because the legal discrimination, it's unlikely or unquantifiable of how much you're going to feel that. However, most minorities feel a lot of microaggressions in their daily life, and this is a tangible thing that harms their everyday life, really adds up to it. And these like fringe supporter members are ones who might also call out their friends when they do these things as well. So just reach a lot of a wider audience of people who stopped you from doing that. And then also in like practical cases, maybe if they're aware of, I don't know, critical race theory, or they're aware of Black Lives Matter and kind of on the supported, this might also make them slightly more conscious of their own biases when they are people who are in like positions to hire someone or something. So having these like less committed members can be really useful in some other circumstances, more important than trying to get through a policy change. Because if you have gay marriage through a court, but no one on the ground supports it, you're still going to get actively discriminated against all the time, and that might be worse. And then lastly, how to weigh off the existing members one. I think this has to be done relatively cleverly, but I think it's possible. So I want to say that the first way to do it is to characterize, like, no matter what legislative change you're going to get, no matter what kind of hearts and minds you're going to win, there is always going to be discrimination. There is always going to be microaggressions against you. There are always going to be problems. Therefore, in that really dire environment, you always will need a safe space where to turn to. You will always need people who share your struggle, because those are the only ones who actually understand. And without that, the movement is really pointless, because the people who are struggling the most, who are the most vulnerable members of the community, are ones who are not really getting any help from it, because they don't have anywhere to turn to. So focusing on that safe space argument by characterizing the world as a really bad place is a way you can win that clash. Or secondly, if you want to again like compare with effectiveness, then saying, especially when you compare, like, should we get new members or should we have a more close-knit, more tight kind of organization or movement, is saying, well, all of those fringe people you get as kind of random supporters of feminism, they're not really going to be helpful, because those are not the people that are going to come out to protests with you. Those are not the people who are going to actually vote in a specific way. Those are not the ones who send letters to politicians, who call out people in their daily lives, or who like make an active change for the movement. And you need those very committed members. There you probably need to do the characterization as to why the commitment to the cause is so important. However, I think you can kind of win that clash through that by focusing on their contribution to the movement is so much greater than like 10 random people. So just kind of going through that. All of these can obviously be contested, and this is not like an exhaustive list in any kind of way. However, I do think that these are some good tips to keep in mind when you are debating any kind of social movements clash. But still, as some maybe specific ideas as to how to get better in social movements debates, is first of all, follow some social movements, see what types of tactics they do, like on Instagram or something, see what is the popular reaction to it in mainstream media, but also more fringe other side media. And there you can see how these things play out in real life. And I would also say, think through your own reasons as to why you support or don't support a specific movement. And especially if we're not supporting, think of why you aren't a more active member than you are right now, even especially if it's like a movement that you should, or it sounds like you would fit into. Like, for example, if you're not very actively engaged in an environmental movement, think through what are the reasons why, and what are the things that are keeping you from attending a protest or something. Or if you outright don't like a movement, think through those reasons for yourself personally, and these can really help you come up with arguments and come up with strategies in a social movements debate. I want to say that this is all, and thank you very much, and good luck for all of your social movements debates.